and welcome to the York Festival of Ideas. I'm sure you're delighted to be here. I certainly am. My name's Penny Spikins, and I'm a professor of the Archaeology of Human Origins here at the University of York. I'll be chairing the event this evening. It's my great pleasure to introduce our speaker, Julian Richards. Julian is not only a well-known TV presenter, author and archaeologist, but also a great friend of York Festival of Ideas, so we're delighted to have him here tonight. Tonight's talk is just one of the 5 events he's kindly contributed to for this year's programme. Julian specialises in the prehistory of Britain and has a long-standing involvement with Stonehenge. He's directed major fieldwork projects and worked in both commercial archaeology and for English heritage before a career change to broadcasting and education. You'll remember Julian, I certainly do, from BBC programmes he's presented, both on TV, such as Meet the Ancestors and Blood of the Vikings. I'm sure many of you have watched those and are keen to hear what he has to say tonight. And on radio, Mapping the Town on Radio 4. We happen to know Julian's passionate about bringing the past to life and is involved in writing, devising and delivering community archaeology projects, working with schools and making non-broadcast film and curating museum exhibitions. I'm really looking forward to hearing Julian speak this evening on the genetic history of the British Isles. Over to you, Julian.
Thank you. It's always wonderful to be here at the Festival of Ideas. I seem to keep inviting myself back because it's such an amazing event and I really love it. And this year I think I possibly let myself in for too many things because I've been doing an indoor excavation with children, chairing a lecture, giving a lecture, and tomorrow 2 sessions for people with sight impairment. So it's been an interesting few days. Now, as a personal introduction, I am an archaeologist. So this is me in my natural habitat, in a field, covered in mud, with a small trowel. I've been involved with archaeology now for about 55 years, and you know, it still excites me. This is the key thing. And one thing that you have to emphasise, and I always emphasise no matter who I'm talking to, is that archaeology is about people. It's about human stories. It's about our ancestors, no matter how far back in time they go. And so this is basically the sort of where this talk is coming from and where my journey in exploring people in the past started was exactly 50 years ago when the first time I excavated a human burial, something I'd not done before. And that experience of being close to somebody from the past, in this case a Roman man buried in the village of Upper Lambourne in Berkshire, I think it sowed seeds that have stayed with me ever since. The fact that I ended up making a programme that was basically about human remains in Meet the Ancestors. So, but over this time, since that, things have changed massively, particularly in terms of the science. Over the last couple of decades, there's really been a revolution in the science that allows us to understand people, particularly through the scientific analysis of their bones. Because when I dug that first burial, we got a local doctor to look at it, who gave me some anatomical details about age and sex and things like that. And that was basically it. Nowadays, through things like isotope analysis and DNA, we can really start to understand people. And I don't know whether any of you were at Duncan's lecture at lunchtime today, but I was very relieved that what Duncan was doing was looking at the very sort of small scale level, looking at family relationships and things like that, which DNA can help to explain. Whereas, as I was saying to him, I'm going to do a very, very broad brush approach. When I said I was going to offer to do this talk, Making Waves, Ripples in the Gene Pool, it was one of those things where you think of a clever title, and then afterwards it comes back to bite you, and you sort of think, what have I said that I'm going to talk about? Little did I know what I was going to let myself in for. Because it's what I'm going to do is to try and match my understanding of the past as an archaeologist through objects with what the genetics are telling us. And it was fascinating to talk to Duncan about how his ideas are just being turned on their head by all the new science that's coming out. So, as a nation, I think we should hopefully be aware that we are an amazing mixture. As individuals, many of us are fascinated with our ancestry. I'm sure a lot of people here have, researched their family tree. You've been to record offices, and these days you can actually do a lot of it online, and you can even get charts that plan your family tree. But genealogy only takes you back so far. I've not been able to get my family tree back beyond about the 18th century because basically I'm not posh. If you're posh, you've generally got a lot more records about your family and what they did, and you can often trace things back much further. And of course, I think this explains the fascination of programs like Who Do You Think You Are? Who do you think you are? I mean, who can forget the programme where Danny Dyer discovered he was descended from royalty? I mean, that's quite unusual, isn't it? And I'm sure many of you have probably done what are referred to as DTCs, direct-to-consumer ancestry tests. Spit in a tube, send it off, and it tells you who you are. It's very interesting. I've never done this, and I know a lot of archaeogeneticists are quite sceptical of the results of this because they use data from present-day populations under the sort of untested assumption that this is going to reflect past genetic diversity. But anyway, if you've done it and you're fascinated with the results, then that's good. But then there's archaeogenetics, the study of ancient DNA, which can, under certain circumstances, survive in ancient bones. And it's strange that sometimes the more solid the bone looks, the less DNA there is preserved. It doesn't really sort of work as a logical progression. And there have been very rapid progress in methods of sampling and sequencing and analysing ancient DNA. Because, of course, what survives in ancient burials is very fragmentary. It's only tiny, tiny fragments. And so what you have to do to create a sequence that you can understand is to break this down into even smaller fragments, duplicate these many times using something known as polymerase chain reaction, and then reassemble that so that you've got something that's actually going to identify overlapping sequences. So by aligning these overlapping sequences, a computer can then reconstruct the original genome sequence. So it's been described to me as rather like putting together a very complicated jigsaw puzzle. You're trying to actually work out from these tiny fragments. So this is why when you actually see ancient DNA being sampled, when people are sampling bones, you'll see archaeologists dressed up in their proper forensic white suits, head to toe, gloves, masks, because it's vitally important that you don't actually get any modern DNA in with the ancient DNA, because if you do, then the process will replicate the modern DNA and completely ruin it. So it's interesting, as Duncan was saying, that, we now need more ancient DNA laboratories. People are very keen to get the samples looked at, but they basically haven't got enough laboratory space. I think it's interesting when you look at what history and archaeology tell you and what genetics tells you. If you study the past through history, linguistics or archaeology, what you're learning about is successful people. So history basically is written by the winners, isn't it? So much of current historical information is actually from a very small group of people. Genetics, by contrast, is the history of the masses because it's not specific. It doesn't matter whether you're rich or poor, whether you're documented or not, it's going to tell you about who you are. So we must also be aware as well that terms, and this is where this whole area gets quite contentious at times, that terms like race and ethnicity, and particularly migration, can have overtones, some of them very negative. Ethnicity and race are actually more social concepts, which define people by physical characteristics rather than genetic differences. And it's very easy, as we've seen a lot, to politicise the past. And I think it's also important to realise how people in the past saw themselves, perhaps not with the labels that history has given them. So, where's the starting point? Now, this is where I'm horribly aware that Penny is a professor of early human origins. Penny, just close your ears for a minute, because I'm going to very, very rapidly go through what I understand of sort of our early hominid ancestors. That, you know, in about 3 million years ago, we've got our earliest human ancestors in Kenya, belonging to species like Australopithecus. 1.8 million years ago, Homo erectus appeared in Africa. And then about 800,000 years ago, in this country, we've got what I think is an absolutely fascinating connection with the past. We're on the east coast of Britain, at a place called Haysborough. There are footprints of people. And, you know, this sort of idea of a connection with the past, I just find this quite extraordinary. I would have loved to have seen them when they were being uncovered. But to actually see a mark made by one of our early hominid ancestors, you know, to me is an incredible connection. So, in Europe then, in Britain, we've got a wonderful site of Boxgrove in Sussex, where Homo heidelbergensis first makes an appearance about between 700 and 300,000 years ago. So these are all, and in fact where our first fragmentary human remains in Britain were found, these are the common ancestors of both Neanderthals and modern humans. So between about 140,000 and 45,000 years ago, modern humans, that is us, Homo sapiens, arrived in Europe from Africa and the Near East, coexisting and probably interbreeding with Neanderthals before that other branch, the Neanderthals, largely died out. Interestingly, and I hope this is correct, Penny, I've understood that Neanderthal DNA makes up roughly 2 to 4% of the genome of the non-African modern humans. And it's one of those again, is that right? Good. What a relief. But it's interesting as well, this idea of perceptions, what we think about people, because you'll hear the word Neanderthal used to describe somebody, you know, brutish, crude. Whereas if you look at the other side of it, Homo sapiens, wise man. That seems a little ironic considering what a mess we're making of everything at the moment, doesn't it? So what we've got here is a gene pool. Ice sheets come and go, and during the colder periods, what will eventually become Britain is uninhabitable. It's largely covered in glacial ice. But after the end of the last glacial maximum, we've got two very rare examples of human burials, which come from the end of what we call the Upper Paleolithic, the Old Stone Age, and the beginning of the Mesolithic, the Middle Stone Age. There's a woman from Gough's Cavern in the Mendips, who's dated to about 15,000 BC. There's a man from Kendrick's Cave in North Wales, who about 1,500 years later. They both share an ancestry, which we'll talk a little bit more about later, which is known as Western hunter-gatherer. These people are what in general terms is known as hunter-gatherers. They're living as part of the natural world, hunting animals, foraging wild foods. Not, as I think people have often suggested, you know, in a continual struggle for food. It's not like that. I think it was actually quite a nice lifestyle, to be quite honest. But this Western hunter-gatherer ancestry is what ends up forming, basically, the gene pool of Britain. At this point, Britain was still joined to the continent. You could walk across what is now the North Sea, but which has now been named Doggerland on the basis that a lot of incredible mapping work has taken place there. So you could certainly walk across what is now the Channel to Europe. So we're not isolated at this point. This is, as I say, the Western hunter-gatherer gene pool, which form one of the main genetic groups in Europe, together with, inevitably, an Eastern hunter-gatherer group, who they're over in Russia, Eastern Europe, and Asia. Now, we have a representative of this Western hunter-gatherer group in a burial who's always known as Cheddar Man. This is the first virtually complete human burial from this country. He lived about 10,000 years ago, and intriguingly, he may not look like what you expect somebody from that time to look at. And of course, his appearance, his reconstructed appearance, based on genetic evidence, has actually caused quite a bit of controversy. It's always been assumed that humans quickly adapted to have paler skin after entering Europe about maybe 45,000 years ago, because pale skin is better at absorbing vitamin D from UV light, and it helps humans to avoid vitamin D deficiency. But Cheddar Man has got the genetic markers of a skin pigmentation usually associated with sub-Saharan Africa. Dark-skinned, light-coloured eyes, and either blue or green eyes, and dark brown hair. So, intriguingly, perhaps not what we might expect some of our Mesolithic ancestors to look like. Now, it was during this Mesolithic period that Britain becomes an island. The last glacial melt, sea levels rise, Britain becomes isolated. And so, effectively, around 6000 BC, we've got a relatively isolated gene pool of Western hunter-gatherers, into which people, over the next thousands of years, cause a series of ripples. Now, the first of these ripples, and the one that I'm actually really fascinated about, happens about 4000 BC. And this is the change from being Mesolithic to being Neolithic, New Stone Age. Traditionally, when I was at university, they're farmers. Farming comes into this country. Something definitely different starts to happen. The mobile hunter-gatherer lifestyle of our Mesolithic ancestors starts to change. There are new forms of stone tools, single-piece arrowheads, ground stone tools, the first pottery, and the first monuments constructed communally by groups of people, either as places of the dead, like this is West Kennet Longbarrow in Wiltshire that I'm very familiar with, or hilltop enclosures for meeting and ceremony and burial rituals. Now, all of these have got parallels on the continent. And what's happening with the economy is that food is now no longer exclusively hunted and gathered, but it's farmed. Now, these new ideas, as I say, paralleled on the continent, houses of the living, houses of the dead, and these domesticated animals and crops. But one thing that people sometimes don't ask is, how did they get here? Because it might seem blindingly obvious. The answer is that they're brought here by people travelling across the Channel and potentially across the North Sea in boats that we don't have any evidence for, but must have existed. Because, you've got to think about this. How do you get a breeding stock of cattle into this country? There aren't cattle here that can be domesticated. It's been estimated that you need to bring at least 80 cows to actually establish a breeding herd. They're not swimming across. They're not coming across in coracles. They must be coming across in proper seafaring boats. So, they're here. And these new people that bring these ideas are early European farmers of Anatolian origin, who in successive waves of expansion across Europe have largely replaced these Western hunter-gatherers. So we've got hunter-gatherers being replaced by early European farmers. And they do look different. They've got olive skin, according to the genetics, dark brown eyes. They do carry a small amount of this hunter-gatherer ancestry, presumably as a result of intermingling and interbreeding in this expansion across Europe. So, why in this country do we see the replacement of one genetic group by another? Because this is largely what happens. And one possible reason are the advantages that are brought by an agricultural lifestyle. Because you've got more stable food supply, stable economy, and this could possibly have an effect on reproductive activity. It could mean that you could have more children more successfully, and therefore your successful genomes will actually replace those of the hunter-gatherers. So this becomes a stable gene pool in the Neolithic, the New Stone Age. And evidence from archaeology shows that it's highly connected throughout the British Isles. You get pottery styles and objects showing contacts between Ireland, Wales, Scotland, pottery that occurs in Orkney, then those styles travel down to the south of England. It's very, very connected. And at the end of our this is suggestions of what some of our early European farmers looked like, and I'm very glad to see that actually somebody did some reconstructions of women for a change, because it always tends to be men that get reproduced. I'm going to shamelessly mention Stonehenge, because it's an example of this connectivity. Because here in Wiltshire, we've got a monument that's made of stones that are quite local, from 20 miles away, stones that come from 125 miles in Wales. And if you've noticed the press over the last few months, a stone, the altar stone, a 6-ton block of sandstone that comes from the Orcadian Basin in the north of Scotland. It's evidence, physical evidence of this connection, of this connectivity within society at that time. But Stonehenge is just part of a massive construction boom that takes place at this time, from Orkney to southern Britain. And to me, it's very difficult to think about the idea, which some people have suggested, that this is a population in decline, because they're building all these massive monuments. But the evidence, even from the environment, suggests that areas that were open are almost becoming rewilded, they're almost becoming abandoned. So, maybe this is what's happening, and maybe these massive monuments are a response. They're saying, right, we're on the way out, but we're going to build some really stupid things just to show that we're not actually on the way out. So this is the gene pool that sees the next ripple. And this, to me, is one of the ones which, as a prehistorian, I've found the most difficult to understand, really. Because it's something that's been visible in the archaeological record for centuries. A different way of burying people, individual crouched burials, accompanied by a range of different and exotic objects, different types of flint arrowheads, barbed and tanged arrowheads, and associated with other archery equipment. The pots, the beakers, these very distinctive, beautifully decorated pots, and, intriguingly, the first metals. Tiny knives of copper, gold objects as well. Now, these beaker burials are so obviously different to anything that's happened before. And you can find parallels on the continent, particularly in sort of the Iberian Peninsula. You can see things like this happening in the Tagus Valley in Portugal in about 2800 BC. So, it's very different. First new shoots of this culture, which is going to have a massive effect. And there's long been the assumption that the people buried with these exotic objects are actually, for want of a better term, non-local. You're not from around here, are you? But it's only since the development of new scientific methods of analysis in the last 30 years that we've actually been able to prove this. And these people bring with them an ancestry that's very, very different from the preceding Neolithic. So these people, basically their origins are with the Yamaya civilization, who are herders on the Asiatic steppes, who moved west into Europe with lighter skin, blonde hair and blue eyes. These are the new success story. Now, a good example of one of these people is a burial that comes from not far from Stonehenge. He's called the Amesbury Archer, and he features in every single television programme about Stonehenge that's been made since his discovery. But he is fascinating because he's got all of the accoutrements. He's got the pots, the archery equipment, the stone wrist guards, the little tiny copper daggers, and some gold hair ornaments. Now, at the time, isotope analysis was in its infancy, and this is something that looks at isotopes of things like lead, strontium, and oxygen in the bones, particularly incorporated in the teeth. And these show when you were born, where you were born, different geological signature, and sometimes a temperature signature as well. So you can tell if somebody's been born on an old geology or a new geology, because the food that they've eaten has taken up those isotopes, stick them in your bones, and they're there for the rest of your life. Now, when the Amesbury Archer was first discovered, it was suggested that he was German. And this was how the tabloid press saw this. Achtung, Great British Monument may have been built by a German. Now, he's not German. He comes from probably the Austrian Alps. And recent studies have shown that his genetic signature is actually interestingly mixed, because he's got about 75% of this ancestry, 25% of that Western hunter-gatherer. So here we've got some rich, influential individuals, but actually we don't know where the rest of the population were buried. They may have been disposed of in ways that we don't understand. But the one thing that's puzzled me is how much of an effect can these incomers have had on the gene pool? And the answer is, from recent studies, absolutely extraordinary. A huge effect, because it's been demonstrated that over a comparatively short period of time, we're talking about 300 years here, 10 to 12 generations, there's an almost complete genomic replacement of the Neolithic population with these beaker incomers. Over 90% of the Neolithic genetic markers are replaced by those of steppe ancestry. Now, as an archaeologist with some long-held views and ideas, I just simply can't work out how that can have happened. How can this be true? But I've had it explained to me, and I think I understand it now. There is evidence that these beaker incomers may have brought with them a version of plague, which obviously an isolated population would have had no resistance to. I mean, there's terrible analogies here, which what happened in colonial times, you know, early explorers introducing things like smallpox to indigenous populations with no resistance, wiped them out. So there is that potential. And what it means is that by about 2200, because the Amesbury Archer dates to around 2450 BC, that's right at the cusp at the end of the Neolithic, beginning of the Metal Age, about 250, 300 years after that, there seems to have been a complete genomic replacement. And even things like styles of pottery die out. There's a particular sort of pot called grooved ware, which is the archetypal late Neolithic pot. It dies out at that time, which suggests again that we've got this extraordinary replacement. So what then happens in the rest of the Bronze Age? Because we've now only got up to about 2000 BC. In the late Bronze Age, about 1000 BC, there's a sudden appearance of a gene for lactose tolerance, because our prehistoric ancestors before that had all been lactose intolerant. What this means is that you can only consume milk in the form of a fermented product like cheese or yogurt, because fermentation actually uses up most of the lactose. But where does this genetic mutation come from? This isn't something probably that happens spontaneously. You know, is this another group of people coming into Britain and introducing this? Recent genetic studies have shown that between about 1000 BC, and this is towards the end of the Bronze Age, and about 850 BC, some of this early European farming ancestry, which has been replaced by the beakers, seems to reappear. It increases in southern Britain. So maybe we've actually got migrants from the continent bringing with them this old ancestry into this country. It appears that these migrants contributed about half the ancestry of people in England and Wales in the Iron Age. And so that actually gives you a plausible path for the transmission of some of the languages that we know from this time, the early Celtic languages. In the succeeding Iron Age, we can see a lot of changes in material culture, the objects that we recognise these different cultures by. And there are parallels that can be drawn with finds from places like Hallstatt in Austria and the Middle to Late Iron Age from Latten in Switzerland. Now, when I was at university, a very long time ago, I was taught that this was all to do with waves of Iron Age invaders. We even had an ABC hypothesis of different waves of invaders coming in and bringing these different styles of metalwork. But this now doesn't seem to work. In this case, it appears that this is actually contact with the continent, but no large-scale migration at this time. No migration, no large-scale invasions, and consequently no big change to the gene pool. Now the next, and perhaps the most obvious one, oh yes, I just wanted to mention this one. Interesting sort of perceptions. This is a burial that we looked at from Meet the Ancestors. An Iron Age burial in Somerset from a little village called Bleeden. And because we used to refer to people from where they came from, he became known as Bleeding Man. The facial reconstruction that we did of him, we took Bleeding Man back to the Bleeding Coronation Hall to meet the Bleeding villagers on a Saturday afternoon. And it's a bit of an aside, but it fascinated me because the perception, when we unveiled the head, the reaction for people was, he looks like us. And I sort of said, well, he actually looked very much like Ralph, who was one of the villagers, who in a slightly dubious bit of genetic study had been shown to be a distant relative of this person. But the perception of people was, because he was prehistoric, somehow he was crude and brutal. And if we'd actually introduced somebody with their knuckles dragging on the ground, that would have fitted their perception. And I said, no, he's a Homo sapiens, he's just like us. And in fact, he was probably living in this place for exactly the same reason as some of you, because it's got good communications, good water supply, good farmland. Why not live here? This just happened to be 2,300 years ago. So to me, that was a very interesting perception of the past. And it was the first of our ancestors that I came face to face with, reinforcing that idea that people are to do with, the past is to do with people. So, the next ripple. It's the Romans. Now, I'm not going to go on about the fact that I don't like the Romans, but I don't. But what happened in 43 AD, when Britain was invaded by the Roman army, was actually the introduction of initially an occupying military force and the mechanics of government, the civil service, the military. If you add in merchants and camp followers, and it brought in people from across the empire. This is the one thing that we have to remember here, perhaps with an emphasis from the western provinces. And, this is what the Roman Empire looked like, at that time. It's vast, it's hugely extensive. Here we are in Britannia, this far-flung outpost, and we're even quite far north in that, aren't we? But, when you look at the extent of the empire, it's a huge catchment area, it's a huge pool. Now, the most visible individuals within Roman Britain tend to be soldiers and administrators, many of whom came from very different parts of the empire. In fact, from the soldiers' point of view, in order to avoid conflicts of interest, they were usually sent from places where they had no association with them, because obviously you didn't want to tyrannize your own people. So you actually, if you were from, Syria, you were sent to Britain because that was actually far away from your homeland. So migration from the rest of Europe was probably dominated by these groups, but the highest impact would have been in urban areas and military areas, like here in York. Obviously here in York, the Emperor Septimus Severus died here in 211, an emperor that was born in Leptis Magna, which is now Libya. So those contacts are there. And the recent studies using isotope data have suggested that there's very high levels of mobility, with 50% of individuals that have been studied, and obviously this is biased because it tends to be more from urban and military settings, having non-local childhoods. Study of 7 individuals from here in York, 7 decapitated burials, highlighted the cosmopolitan nature of the Roman urban setting by identifying an individual with Middle Eastern or North African ancestry. But by contrast, the rural areas were probably very little affected. Now, the comparative archaeological record from excavated burials is quite fascinating, because in some cases, people were buried with objects that, if you looked at them at face value, would suggest that they had cultural links from abroad. But in fact, what's happening in some cases, and I've seen examples of this in Winchester, is that those people are buried with objects that reflect their ancestry. They represent a cultural link with a place that their parents or their grandparents might have come with, but they're still maintaining that link through the burials, through the objects that they're buried with. Now, by the end of this Roman occupation of Britain, the population, we think, by the 4th century has grown to about 3.6 million, of which 125,000 consisted of the Roman army, their families and dependents. And at this time, the urban population of Britain was estimated to be about 240,000 people. Of these, about 160,000 of them 60,000 of them were living in the capital city of Londinium, which was at this time, we know, a very ethnically diverse city, with inhabitants from all over the Roman Empire. Here, I must mention, another little aside, Spitalfields woman, somebody we looked at in the Ancestors programme, an incredibly rich burial found in Spitalfields in London, in the middle of a medieval cemetery, a highly decorated lead coffin inside a stone sarcophagus, a woman buried with her head on a pillow of laurel leaves, wearing clothes of silk embroidered with gold thread, an incredibly wealthy individual. And the question, of course, was, where was she from? Was she local, or was she actually from somewhere else in the Roman Empire? And at the time, this isotope study was in its infancy, and Janet Montgomery, who pioneered a lot of this work, suggested that she did come from the continent, but she wasn't quite sure where, possibly from southern France. But then, a few years after that, Janet was given some burials from Rome to look at, and realised that the lead signature in their bones matched exactly with Spitalfield woman. She was born in Rome. And, you know, it might seem an obvious thing, but I think she was probably the first person that could actually be positively identified as she was a Roman. She'd come from Rome. Janet is my kind of scientist, because she told me that when she got the results of this, as she put it, I danced around the laboratory. And I thought, that's my sort of scientist. So this cultural diversity appears to have been shared by many Roman towns. A study conducted in 2012, about 45% of sites investigated dating from the Roman period had at least one individual of North African origin. But actually, despite this, although culturally and genetically very diverse, because it came from the whole of the Roman Empire, it may not have had much of an effect on the gene pool as we might have expected. Because small numbers coming from many different places, there's no one overall genetic signature like there appears to be with, say, the effect of the Beaker people, to have actually radically changed that gene pool. And in language too, there's not much of an effect. We only have about 800 Latin words incorporated into our language, into the Brittonic language that was in use before that. So, you know, and that survived obviously after the Roman occupation and developed into the languages, the regional ones that we see today, Cumbric, Cornish, Breton and Welsh, of course. It's worth noting that the current majority language, English, is based on the language of the Germanic tribes who migrated to this island from continental Europe from the 5th century onwards, which of course brings us to the next ripple. Now, traditional history talks about waves of migration. Anglo-Saxons, Jutes, coming in the 5th century after the end of the Roman occupation. And it's very interesting to see these in terms of names like East Anglia, Sussex. But this is very much the sort of politicisation of the past. These people wouldn't have thought of themselves in that way. And obviously migration is another area of contention. Sometimes an unwillingness from archaeologists to actually see migration happening, particularly, I remember back in the 1990s. Instead, it was tempting to see what was happening were objects coming in rather than people. If you look at the evidence from cemeteries, you know, this is what we were traditionally told, wasn't it? These waves of different people coming into Roman Britain, you know, after the end of the Roman occupation. And if you look at the grave goods from a lot of these cemeteries, they're very Germanic, they're very obvious, and particularly over in the eastern side of the country. But, you know, are these actually telling us that they're just objects? Are these telling us that they're actually people coming in? What's fascinating is when large-scale genetic studies take place, then what they're showing is that particularly in the eastern side of the country, you've got about 75% Germanic origin DNA within the population of these cemeteries. There's a wonderful example, again, one of the programmes we did for Ancestors, a site at Lakenheath in Sussex, where a warrior burial was the central part of this cemetery. Here, almost entirely Germanic DNA. So what that implies is a very closed community of people who've come here, settled, and actually are just simply existing as a closed community. But it's not a consistent pattern, because a cemetery very close by shows a completely different pattern, that you've got here an intermingling of local population and Saxon incomers. So it's not consistent. And also, when you look at some of the objects that are being found, and I was fascinated by part of Duncan's title talking about the African connection. If you look at some of the objects, we have burials from this period that are buried with ivory rings. And it's not walrus ivory, it's elephant ivory. So that implies these objects a very deep connection, which is reflected now, starting to be reflected in the genetic makeup. One thing that's very obvious that you'll all be aware of here in York is Vikings. Now forget the horned helmets, forget all of the 19th century invention. History book tells us that these are brutal seafaring predators who travelled from their Scandinavian homelands to raid and pillage. But what genetic effect did they have on our gene pool? Because, of course, it's an interesting idea. Viking is more a sort of concept. You know, you go Viking, you're a pirate. You go Viking in the west, which means you come over here and you raid. And there's been a sort of simple division between Norwegian Viking raiders and Danish Viking settlers. We did a genetic study for the Blood of the Vikings programme 25 years ago, which enabled us to identify a Norwegian Viking signature where you'd expect to find it, in the Northern Isles, down through Cumbria, in the Isle of Man, into Ireland. The Danish Vikings, who we know invaded in the 9th century and after being beaten by Alfred were allowed to settle in this part of the country, the Danelaw, very difficult to find their genetic signature because it was too similar at the time to the signature from the Saxons, the migrants that had come in from the Germanic lands a few centuries earlier. So that sort of confused the picture. That the Viking world is far more extensive than we think. It's intriguing that Duncan mentioned the fact that a site in Kent had a Saxon burial from the 7th century, which had an object of paralleled in Norway, but it couldn't possibly be from Norway, could it? Even though the object looked as if it came from there, the genetics showed that that person had come from Norway. So some of our simple ideas, they're a lot more complicated than we might have expected. Just a mention here of a site in Dorset. We think of Vikings as being violent raiders. In 2008, a mass grave was found while building a road. About 53 individuals killed, 51 of them had their heads lopped off and piled in a heap at one side of the grave. Was it a Viking raiding party? The isotopes and genetics showed that it was, slaughtered in around 1000 AD. So, last of our major ripples, the Norman conquest. But actually, when you think about it, and I mean, the analogy that I've often used is when we try and study ancient metals, when we start to study ancient bronze, we know where the copper came from, we know where the tin came from, we can isolate that. Then it gets melted down and mixed with other stuff in this melting pot, and gradually the individual elements are lost. We got this homogeneity. Think about what went on at the time of the Norman conquest. Yes, we're invaded by Normans. But who are Normans? They're actually Vikings. The Normans are Norsemen. Vikings were adaptable. They'd turned up in what we now regard as northern France as pagan, Norse-speaking raiders. And because they're adaptable, they'd very rapidly become French-speaking Christian settlers, refounding monasteries that they'd plundered. Then they came and invaded us and introduced that other complicated element. So it's quite intriguing because as you go on, it all gets just so wonderfully, incredibly mixed up. I'm going to sort of cut this a little bit short now because I have gone on for far too long, but there are a whole series of other ripples that occur from, in the historic period. Because we've got waves of Huguenots, Flemings, Walloons, German Palatines coming in the 16th, well, from the 13th century onwards. They're coming in, they're bringing in, interestingly, skills that we need. Most of them are Protestant refugees fleeing religious persecution on the continent. You know, some of them, they're given the choice, you either convert to Catholicism or you go. A lot of people went. They came to this country. Many of them were welcomed because they brought with them skills, weaving, cloth making. Huguenots had a great effect on our economy. They helped found the Bank of England. And I was absolutely fascinated looking at this particular period to find that there's a whole series of very recognisable Huguenot surnames. And one of those is Farage. So here we've got an extraordinary mixture of people. I mean, in shades of the way things are seen today, you know, not all people were welcomed. It was found, you know, some of the Palatine Germans who'd fled, apparently, you know, economic and religious persecution, were actually Catholics, which of course didn't go down very well. You're supposed to be Protestants fleeing from persecution. What are you doing here? So it's a very long and it's a very complicated history. It's not the end of the story. I'm going to cut it short at this point. It's very complex. And it's only, the genetic studies are only just starting to unravel certain elements of the early part of this history. From hunter-gatherer to farmers, through beakers, Bronze Age to Roman occupation, Germanic migration, from Norsemen to Normans and beyond. You know, I find this a fascinating and very thought-provoking and occasionally contentious and quite rapidly evolving story. As I said at the beginning of this talk, I think what we should be aware of as a nation is what we should be aware of and celebrate just what an amazing, wonderful and unique mixture we are that's been contributed to by all of these waves and ripples over decades, centuries and millennia. And, you know, be fascinated with your own ancestry, even if you haven't done a DNA test. So, thank you very much.
Hi, Julian. Thanks for a fascinating talk. Here in York, we're quite close to the east of the tribe of Parisi, and they do chariot burials.
Oh,
we're
yes.
the only area that does that. Has any work been done on the DNA of that area?
I have to, you know, I am not a genetic specialist. I'm not a DNA specialist. I mean, I'm aware that people have looked at these chariot burials in Yorkshire and gone, well, actually, the only place that you find those on, you know, on the continent, you know, is this. But I don't think that anybody's actually provided a genetic link with the people that are buried with these chariots, which are effectively carts. And this is in the Iron Age, and that area in, you know, the tribal area in France. I mean, it's a fascinating idea. And of course, I think as, you know, as talking to Duncan today, as the genetics become more available and cheaper, because he was talking about when they first started doing their studies, it was costing £100,000 to do a sample, and it's now got down to a matter of a few hundreds. I think as things like this are going to be applied more extensively, I think we're going to find some fascinating new information and new patterns coming out. But I don't know that there's actually any link been proved with that so far.
In view of the cost of isotope analysis and DNA testing and everything else, how many archaeological tests have actually been done, roughly? Is it 10,000, 100,000 or a million?
No, it's like a lot of these new methods of analysis. When they first appear, they are very, very expensive. Then the whole process becomes simpler, more streamlined. They become cheaper. I was saying to Duncan, what would fascinate me is that, you know, various research projects are undertaken looking at specific cemeteries. But because of how much commercial archaeology has happened in this country over the last 30 odd years, our museums are full of cemetery assemblages of all sorts of periods, some of which have not been really looked at very much at all because that commercial archaeology doesn't allow for a level of research. If you started to look at those, I think you'd get some utterly fascinating results. Duncan mentioned a cemetery in Dorset, which nobody knew what date it was because all the burials hadn't got any grave goods with them. They radiocarbon dated them, found that they were 7th century, and this is where he found an individual who'd got African ancestry. Probably I think her great-grandfather was African in a cemetery in Dorset in the 7th century. In the past, that would just have been an undated cemetery. Nothing would have been done about it. So I think once we start to be able to apply these results more broadly, I think some even more fascinating results are going to come out. I mean, it's an evolving story. And I think this is the whole point about archaeology. You know, there are no definitive answers. Ideas will change, new discoveries will be made. I mean, your field changes incredibly rapidly, doesn't it?
Yeah, absolutely.
And so, you know, this, what to me is what's so fascinating about it. You know, it's evolved over my lifetime as an archaeologist, and it will continue to. So that's why I still find it fascinating.
Thank you. Okay, I'm sure after that you've inspired some people to go and do that research as well, and we'll probably see you on telly talking about it.
I don't think so. I'm too old.
Oh, no, we'd like to see you on telly talking about it. Well, that was a wonderful talk. It certainly inspired me to think about archaeology being about people, which it very much is. So I'd like to say a big thank you to Julian. That was a wonderful talk. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Sorry to have to cut